afternoon. It's really difficult to get the attention of teachers when there's food in the room. I know this. I want to remind you that please continue your meal. There's coffee and cookies over toward the exit doors to your, well, it doesn't really matter, to your right or left, that way. My name is Vicki Gillis, and I have the great pleasure of introducing our speaker at lunch, Dick Allington. Probably the easiest way to introduce Dick would be to say he's done everything and been everywhere. But to be more specific, he's professor of literacy at Tennessee. He was previously at the University of Florida and at Albany SUNY. He served as president of the International Reading Association, the National Reading Conference. He was awarded the Albert J. Harris Award in recognition of his contribution to the understanding of reading and learning disabilities, and he was awarded the William Gray Citation of Merit for his contributions to the profession. He's authored over 100 articles, many books, but the most important thing to tell you about Dick is this. When you leave this lunch today after his talk, you will have received at least two wonderful gifts. One is Dick will make you proud that you are a teacher, and he will give you information that you can use in your classroom on Monday to be a better one. Dick.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and how's lunch? They said, aren't you going to eat lunch? And I said, well, it's about 2:30 my body time. And normally I don't eat at 2:30. And I had lunch at about 9:30 this morning. Most of you called it breakfast. I want to talk to you this afternoon about what really matters for developing readers. And you have a paper in your collection, in your bag, that Pat Cunningham and I wrote recently that was titled, when we sent it in, Struggling Readers Need What Good Readers Need. They just need more of it. And they changed the title to something terrible without telling us. Well, it's not terrible. It's just not very interesting. So the issue that I want to focus on is that early intervention, and particularly the K-3 years, are critical. There's a new report called Double Jeopardy. It's a report from the Annie E. Casey Foundation on what happens to kids who leave third grade not reading on grade level. And basically, across all kids, the kids who leave third grade not reading on grade level are 4 times as likely to drop out of school compared to the kids in the same classroom who leave third grade reading on grade level. And poor children, the kids that have presented us the biggest problems and in terms of reading achievement in this country, who aren't reading on grade level, are 13 times as likely as their wealthier and more proficient peers to drop out of school. 13 times. But if we get those third graders reading on grade level, roughly 90% of the kids of the poor kids who finish third grade reading on grade level graduate from high school. That graduation rate is actually no different between poor kids and rich kids. It's just that many more poor kids fail to be reading on grade level by third grade. I worry that we've had lots of supposedly scientifically based, reliable, replicable research guiding our federal policy. The problem is that there was almost no research guiding federal policy. What there was a bunch of entrepreneurs who made gazillions of dollars, but as you probably know, Reading First didn't work to improve the reading achievement of those poor kids in those Reading First schools. Well, it improved how fast they could read nonsense syllables at the end of first grade, compared to kids that weren't in Reading First schools. But at first grade, second grade, and third grade, no difference on the standardized reading achievement scores of kids in Reading First and non-Reading First schools in terms of the amount of improvement they made. That lack of any effect for the Reading First program, combined with the corruption in the Reading First program identified by the Department of Education's Inspectors General's office, corruption that led to the resignation of all of the technical assistance centers directors at the University of Oregon, the University of Texas, and Florida State University, and the removal of all the Reading First personnel in the Washington office, all to be either fired or sent to another agency to work, means that you don't have to worry about Reading First anymore. You also don't have to plan on getting Reading First money anymore. About $1 trillion wasted on things that nobody had any research that demonstrated would work. And we don't need any more research. We've known since the 1960s that teaching kids to pronounce nonsense syllables is a waste of time unless you are the developer and owner of a nonsense word test. In fact, it seems to have a negative effect on word reading and reading achievement, particularly word recognition while reading, because you have to suppress the cross-checking mechanism that kids should be developing when they learn to read, and they produce a word that doesn't make sense, that they say to themselves, that doesn't make sense. That's not a real word. Or when they make an error that doesn't make sense semantically or syntactically, they say, well, that can't be right because it doesn't fit that sentence. But we can suppress and train kids just to bark at print. And we've got lots of schools that are working very hard at getting kids barking at print. And now we have it trailing over into the response to intervention movement, where they're trying to monitor how fast kids can bark at print, but not actually paying much attention to how well they read. This quote comes from a chapter on dyslexia by two senior NICHD researchers. Frank Filatino was my colleague at the University of Albany for some 30 years, and Jack Fletcher is down at the University of Houston. And I say senior NICHD researchers because both of these guys are older than me. And both of them have generated hundreds of millions of federal dollars to support the research that they've been doing for the last 40 years on dyslexia and learning disabilities. And the conclusion they raise in this new book on what the science of reading actually says basically argues there are no children with learning disabilities and there are no children with dyslexia. That their research demonstrates that the hypothesized neurological impairment that existed in kids we call learning disabled simply does not exist. That some kind of neurological damage or deficit doesn't exist in kids that we call dyslexic either. They argue basically what their research shows that there are kids you could call teacher disabled, teaching disabled, curriculum disabled, or school disabled, but there are no children who are learning disabled. That when children that we call dyslexic and learning disabled get a substantial amount of intensive expert reading instruction, suddenly they're reading on grade level. In other words, struggling readers struggle because of us, not because of them. Most struggling readers in this country, 80% or more of them, are also kids from low-income families. These are the kids most likely to start school who already don't know, who don't already know the letters of the alphabet. In 2008, in the National Early Childhood Study, they demonstrated that 2/3 of all children starting kindergarten in 2008 already knew all of the letter names, upper and lower case on the first day of school. If you wanted a death knell for a letter of the week curriculum, that would be a good one. If your district hasn't insisted that kindergarten teachers ensure that all kindergartners know all the letter names by Halloween at the latest, then it's the district that's the problem. And teaching the alphabet's not rocket science. You know, there are only those 26 letters. And the best way to do it is to give a kid, first of all, a pen and a pencil, and then give them lots of opportunities to listen to big book stories and to explore writing with their scribble and scratch pads. But if we provided all kids, starting in kindergarten or before, with sufficiently expert and sufficiently intensive and sufficiently focused instruction, we wouldn't have kids that aren't reading on grade level. We have 4 studies that have been done in Texas and in New York State, in Colorado, and in Florida that demonstrate that 98% of all kids who walk into kindergarten can be reading on grade level by the end of first grade. The only kids that can't, that aren't reading on grade level, fall into 2 basic categories, and that's 1, kids with some severe or profound intellectual disabilities, and kids with severe and profound mobility problems. These are the kids that tend 3 or 4 elementary schools in their kindergarten year, and then 3 or 4 more in their first grade year, and so on. School attendance is another issue. When you realize that 30% of Title I eligible or poor children in this country miss more than 30 days of school a year on average, compared to the 3 days a year the typical child misses, we start to see part of the problem. And solving that problem is not that hard, but it requires that the principal of the school is actually in his or her car, out banging on the door with a baseball bat or one of those foghorns outside of every window to get somebody up and get the kid in the car, because you can't educate the kid if he's still in bed in the morning. In other words, it's reading instruction that kids get that really matters. And we've known this for a while. In Tennessee, we're the inventors and the first developers and users of value-added assessment, not to evaluate teachers, but to evaluate schools and how schools are doing. And what the research has shown in Tennessee is that when children in kindergarten, first and second grade are placed in teachers' classrooms where that teacher regularly produces gains that are put her in the top 25% of all teachers, and you put another group of kids are in classrooms and teachers who are in the bottom 25% of all teachers in terms of the amount of growth they produce on standardized tests. By the end of second grade, or 3 years, there's a 50 percentile difference. One group's at the 20th percentile, the other group's at the 70th percentile. And these are kids going to the same school, from the same neighborhoods, and so on. I mean, those are powerful data for suggesting the power that teachers have. Bob Pianta's work has also noted that in their K-3 study, about 25% of the teachers routinely taught everybody to read, and they made no referrals to special education, and they made no recommendations for retention and grade, literally over a 5-year period. Another 25% of the teachers accounted for 75% of the referrals and 75% of the recommendations for retention, and they almost could teach no one to read. 50% of the teachers accounted for the remaining 25% of the referrals, and they taught all the kids that researchers would predict would be easy to teach. Your children, my grandchildren, to read. It was the kids who needed more expert instruction, more intensive instruction, that were successful in those classrooms. So if you wonder why teachers are suddenly getting a bad name in so many policymakers, it's because what they've been hearing about is that At least a quarter of the teachers in Wyoming are largely incompetent, and Piana's work suggests they also don't like children very well. In other words, they engage in more activities known to suppress motivation for learning or motivation for reading than they do in activities that foster motivation. The top 25% of the teachers only rarely have one of the demotivating events in their classroom, but will have 8 to 15 motivating events for every one that's in the classrooms of the bottom 25%. We also know that with the power of professional development, but here we're talking about 30 to 60 hours of professional development plus follow-up classroom coaching may be the key. Both Donna Scanlon at the University of Albany and Miguel Franzen at the University of Tennessee have provided powerful evidence that in Scanlon's case, that K1 teacher professional development basically eliminates the need for resource room teachers or reading specialists. And in Ann's case in kindergarten in both Philadelphia and in Knox County, Tennessee, that we can have every kid literally in kindergarten testing out at a middle first grade level by the end of kindergarten without a single worksheet or a single skill drill. But as the teachers in the professional development workshop say, why didn't anyone ever teach us this before? And I have no idea why most school districts have this idiotic notion they can hire people out of college and put them into a job with the same responsibilities as somebody with 10 or 20 years experience and expect that they're going to be successful. I mean, there's no other occupation where they simply hire you in the FBI right out of college and give you a gun and a fast car and a badge and say, go to work. And I think being an FBI agent, well, perhaps more dangerous, is probably, although probably more teachers were killed last year than FBI agents, but that's because there's a lot more teachers to shoot at. But to be an airline pilot, no one says, you've got an airline. My brother's a pilot for American and flies back and forth between Chicago and Dusseldorf. But they didn't take him when he had his pilot's license and could fly a little Piper plane and suddenly give him that 757 to fly. It took him 20 years of training and flight simulations and working his way from an MD-80 to finally to 707 and finally on up the scale until he was flying the big planes. But that's that gradual increasing of responsibility that's common in most jobs in this country, but not in teaching. The teacher on the first day of school, out of her first year of teaching from the teacher ed program, is typically given no more professional development, no more advice or coaching than the teacher who's coming in for her 20th year. What Scanlon showed was that providing that 30 to 60 hours and plus coaching in the 3 schools that were assigned to get the coaching reduced the numbers of kids who were struggling with reading to less than 1% of the school's population. It was more powerful than providing one-to-one tutoring in kindergarten and first grade by reading specialists for the same kids. And I hate to say that, it may be that we don't need reading specialists, that what we really need are kindergarten teachers that know what they're supposed to do and know how to do it, and first grade teachers. But I think the bigger problem we have is that most kindergarten and first grade teachers still think that kids who are hard to teach are somebody else's problem. And that somebody else is a special ed teacher, a speech therapist, a paraprofessional, a reading specialist, or whatever. What kids do during the reading block predicts what kids are going to learn during the reading block. If you want kids to learn nonsense syllables, then teach nonsense syllables. You want them to learn to read, then teach them to read. You want them to focus on comprehension, then you need to focus the reading block on comprehension. You want to build their vocabulary, then you need to focus on vocabulary development. mention this, and I mean, this is what we call the just duh phenomena. But look at the research. Look at the research on vocabulary instruction in elementary school classrooms. For that matter, look at it in high school chemistry classrooms. I mean, if kids don't already know the words, they're not likely to learn it from their teachers. They're not likely to learn it from their textbooks. And they're not likely to learn it by looking it up in a dictionary and copying it out. And we've known that for 50 years, but it's still the single most common vocabulary development activity in the country. Still, the most common is one that we know didn't work 50 years ago. I can't explain it. So I'm suggesting we try what I call a simple but research-based redesign. And this is my point. Last night you heard Dave Kirk talk about 5 principles for putting children first. Well, these are my 6 principles for making readers out of children that show up in our classroom. The first one is that every day, every child, and when I say child, I mean K-12, will read something they've selected. Every day they're going to read something that they can read accurately. Every day they're going to read something that they understand. Every day they're going to write something that's meaningful to them. Every day they're going to have the opportunity to talk with their peers about their reading and writing, and every day they're going to listen to a fluent adult do a read aloud. This issue of read something they've selected, in the Guthrie and Humanick meta-analysis of some 28 studies that had been experiments that were run to try to improve reading comprehension in the classroom, they found that choice and access to interesting text were the 2 most powerful factors in the studies. But in addition to the research behind it, most adults in this room haven't read a text they were assigned since their last graduate class. In real life, I read the stuff that I select. I don't read the stuff that somebody else tells me I have to read. And when I'm done with it, I may engage my wife or one of my children or one of my colleagues or somebody sitting next to me in the airplane in a conversation about the book that I just finished. But I don't take multiple choice tests. I don't do vocabulary worksheets. I read for understanding. You do the same thing. So my question is, when are kids supposed to learn how to engage in selecting books that they're interested in and in engaging in conversations, literate conversations with others about the books they just read? If that isn't part of the mission of school, if that isn't the central mission of school, then we're doing something wrong. This graph shows the 4 factors that accounted for literally all the variance in improved reading comprehension in the 28 studies that Guthrie and Humanick analyzed. You can see these down at the bottom are the effect sizes. There's huge effect sizes for student choice and access to interesting text. And access to interesting text is simply that, in other words, if your classroom library currently has at least 1,500 titles across at least 5 grade levels that of difficulty that kids can choose from, raise your hand. So that's there are 3 people, maybe 4. Now all we need is another 155 people to get with it, and they will have classrooms of the sort that improve reading comprehension. If you want reading comprehension not to improve, have everybody read the same damn text, and whether they like it or not, and make sure it's a text that's been picked by a commercial publisher, which means it wasn't interesting enough to sell on the real market, and so the author has given the rights to reproduce it and put it in the anthology to the publisher. It's also so neutral on everything that nobody in California, where they worry about things like smog and food quality, will object, and nobody in Texas where they worry about sex, drugs, and rock and roll will object, and nobody in Tennessee where they worry about people being portrayed as rednecks or hillbillies will object. So the next thing you know, you have a text that no one found objectionable, and it's hard for me to believe. Some of my favorite books you can find right now on the NCTE website because it's Banned Book Month, and I look at the parts that they've identified as being overly sexual or anti-religious or something, and I think to myself, because I go and look at them because I'm always surprised that the Diary of a Part-Time Indian, for instance, because there was no sex or violence, but there was a father who was a bit of an alcoholic, and but somehow that became also a sexual, and because the boy is sort of helping his father get through life, became an inappropriate portrayal of adults. It's an inappropriate way for an adult to act, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen, and it doesn't mean that kids might not benefit from learning that maybe they can help their parents, not just themselves. Student choice, and again, everybody who's got, let's say, an intervention program for struggling readers, where the struggling readers only read what they want to read, raise your hand. Okay, well, there are 5 people. That leaves 114 people that have to get with it. People say, well, but they can't pick books. Well, no wonder they can't pick books they can read. They've never been given the chance to pick books, and they've been given very little instruction on how to pick books. Every summer, I get these calls at the beginning of the summer, right before summer vacation begins, from parents. Do you have any hard books that you'd recommend my son read this summer? I say, no, but I have some I could recommend you could read. Because nobody in this room likes reading hard books. I mean, there's a reason why John Grisham writes at a 10th grade readability level, even though the typical reader of John Grisham is a college graduate. There's a reason that the romance novels that are so popular with a huge part of the American female population are written at the 6th grade level. It's the same reason that People magazine and Us magazine are written at the 6th grade level. And the same reason that Time and Newsweek are written at the 10th grade level. There are 12th and even college level magazines. I don't know how many of you, for instance, subscribe to The Economist, but you hardly ever see it by the cash out stand at the grocery store. And the overall sales figures are 1/1000th of what People magazine is. But there's a reason that publishers generate those levels of difficulty, and that's because most people, when they're reading, don't like to read hard stuff. Access to books through classroom libraries is absolutely essential. That's even if you've got a good librarian or 2 in your building, and you've got that 30 to 50,000 book school library, and you've got open access periods all day long so kids can go to the library anytime they need a book, and your library is open at least 90 minutes before school and 2 hours a day after school. If you have all of that, you still need classroom libraries. If you don't have all of that, then you need to get busy on improving your library. We don't need any more studies demonstrating that part of the reason that Louisiana and California rank last and next to last on the national assessment for educational progress in reading is that in neither state do even half the public schools in the states have a library. None. And what they call a library in California and Louisiana are often leftovers from the Title I era, the old Title III Free Books for High Poverty Schools bill. And so you can't find a book in those libraries that's been published since the children's parents were born. Not the children, but the children's parents. When you start looking at the high poverty schools' libraries, it's easier to find a book as you're walking along the shelf that was published in the 1950s or 60s than it is a book that was published in the 2000s. All classrooms, K-12, need classroom libraries. And I say that 500 to 1,000 is a good start, even for a chemistry library, a chemistry classroom library. But in too many schools, there's no budget for building classroom libraries. But it's not because they don't have the money. It's because that somebody in the system doesn't have the brains to invest in things that we actually know work, as opposed to investing in things like test prep and workbooks and so on, that we've got 50 years of evidence that demonstrate if you want kids to be stupid, those are good ways to spend your money. If you want them to become readers or even to score well on the Wyoming State test, then you don't want to waste their time on workbook pages or on test prep material and so on. I mean, the Bloomberg News had a wonderful article a couple of years ago that test publishers, the folks that present our state test as well as our Terra Novas and Gates McGinnity tests and so on, of their profits, less than 30% of their profits comes from their test sales. Almost 70% of their profits come from the sale of test preparation materials. In other words, they love test prep because it makes them a lot of money. For the same reason that the publishers of your core reading programs love workbooks, and they love unit tests because they are cheap to produce, and you have to buy a new one every year. That's the only rationale. And if you want to waste kids' time, those are both damn good ways to do it. But don't expect that either will result in anything other than dumber kids and kids who aren't very interested in reading. Kids need to read accurately. The only time this is really a problem is at the very beginning of first grade, or the end of kindergarten, the beginning of first grade. As kids are moving from pretend reading to real reading. But by the middle of first grade, the typical child now has at least 500 sight vocabulary words he can recognize like that, and enough decoding skills that he can decode most 1- and 2-syllable words that he's going to meet if they're phonetically regular. And what we know is that the reason some kids read fluently and at the end of by the middle of first grade is they have those 500 what have been historically known as sight words, but they're literally words they've now are firmly embedded in their brain, and every time their eyes transmit to the brain the same letter sequence pattern, they come up with a word instantaneously. No sounding out necessary. What happens to the rest of us is that by the time we finish high school, we've got about a 5,000 word sight vocabulary. In other words, 5,000 words that when we see it, we instantly know what it is. Some of us have larger and some smaller. It depends on how good a reader you are and how much you've actually read. But the more accurate reading you've done, the larger the vocabulary of instantly recognized words, which is why when you read the newspaper or when you read John Grisham, you rarely come across a word that you have to slow down and sound out. It's also one of the reasons why you rarely come across a word you can't pronounce. And I'll tell you this, if John Grisham wrote with a few more words you couldn't pronounce, no one would like him. And no one would read him. Because adults don't like hard reading, and most adults like to read at about a 99.9999% accuracy. In other words, 2 words per John Grisham novel is fine, but you get more than 2 words and you start to think, he's using one of those thesauruses to look up hard words that nobody's ever heard of before. Linnea Airy and her colleagues recently did a study of early intervention study, and Airy, perhaps because she's a school psychologist by training, was surprised to find out that you could explain how much growth kids made by how many texts they read during the intervention intervention at 98 or 99 or 100% accuracy. In other words, none of the other variables that they'd identified as potential predictors had any power once you knew how many texts they'd actually read with a high level of accuracy. And if you think about it, and think about the number of texts that struggling readers in your school read with 99% accuracy or better, compared to the number of texts that the top 25% of the kids in your school as readers read with 99% accuracy, you start to see why our schools are designed for your children and my grandchildren, not for those other people's kids. Because we routinely give struggling readers the hardest texts in the world. And high school teachers are completely, they claim to be completely guilt-free, because if the kid couldn't read the book, he shouldn't be in my damn class. And besides that, I might have picked a different book, but someone picked this book for me. And if you want not to be a teacher, if you understand the lesson planning process as taught in every teacher training program, which is first figure out what you're going to teach. The first step isn't see what comes next in the book they gave you. And then second is to find appropriate materials. There is no lesson planning model that I've been able to find that says find an appropriate material, or find one material that's appropriate for you but not for anybody else, and teach from that. And yet if you look at most of our high school instruction, there's a reason why roughly 30% of the kids in the U.S. drop out of high school, or something in the range of about, I think I just read 6,000 an hour drop out every hour of every school hour of every day. And that's because they've got a desk full of books they can't read. When the Society for the Advancement of Science, in their classic study 2061, point out that the typical science book used in American science classrooms is written somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5 years above the grade level it's being used in, you start to understand why some people think science is hard. I tried this with my graduate students. I like to give them books on, that have sentences that are 300 words long, and words that they've never seen because the author made them up. What that usually happens is that many of those students then drop my class. And then I tell the rest of them I'm just kidding. But we can either write in arcane language that people don't understand, or we can write in plain language that people do understand. And there are some incredibly powerful science writers out there who've made some of the most complex topics in the world absolutely and essentially clear to a fifth grade level reader. But those people aren't the ones they hire to write science textbooks. They hire people off the street to write science textbooks. If you notice, science textbooks always have a university professor or two on the author team, but authors don't actually write the books. Textbooks are the only place you can be an author and never have written a word of the book that you're listed as the author of. But it's also the only gig that I know of where you don't have to write a book, but you get to collect royalties when they sell. So it's an engaging proposition for lots of folks, but it's still largely more a criminal activity than it is any professional activity. We know now from the analyses that have been done since 2001 that there's nothing in any core reading program in terms of phonemic segmentation that matches anything that the research suggests. There's nothing in there that matches what the research suggests about teaching phonics, nothing that matches what the research says about teaching vocabulary, and nothing in what the research says about that matches the teaching of comprehension. And yet I get superintendents and principals and curriculum coordinators who tell me they're buying this book because their teachers don't know how to teach and they need some guidance. And that's like saying, well, our parents don't know how to raise their children, so we gave them all a copy of Marquis de Sade, which nobody would recognize as an ideal parenting manual, but it's better than nothing, right? much accurate reading kids need to do. But I know that I can't sustain much effort on hard reading. I'm deaf in my right ear, and it happened when I took a nap one day at our lake house. My wife says that's why I went deaf. It was God's will, that I should have been out raking or cleaning the boat or doing some of the things that needed to be done, but I fell asleep reading a book. And when I woke up, I couldn't hear out of one ear. I was also had, what's that called when you want to throw up all the time? Yeah, vertigo. And so I stood up, fell down, threw up, stood up, fell down, threw up, and I didn't get it all cleaned up, at least not well enough by the time she got home. And after a few months of direct steroid injections into my inner ear and a steroid treatment, I stopped throwing up, but I still can't hear. When I first went deaf and finally stopped throwing up, if I sat still, I went on the web and I searched under deaf in one ear. And it took me a subtopic called Meniere's disease, which is what it's called, and has been since 1750. And what I learned is it's not really a hearing problem, it's a brain problem. That it's nothing that's wrong with your ear, it's something like the hypothesized neurological damage or deficit that LD kids have. People who have what is technically known as single-sided deafness also have something wrong with their brain, but they don't know quite what it is, and they don't know how to fix it. So the advice was live with it. But when I first clicked, I was taken to an article in the Journal of Otolaryngology. Way too hard. So I clicked on it, started to read it, and I don't understand a thing here. So I clicked on the second one. Still too hard. Clicked on the third one. By the time I got to the fifth one, it was a plain language document from the National Institute of Health about single-sided deafness and Meniere's disease, and it had hot links to other plain language documents. And I clicked on those and read for a while. And after a couple of days of reading and these plain language documents, I could go back and start to understand the first ones, because I started to build the prior knowledge that was assumed in the Journal of Otolaryngology, which I wouldn't recommend for beach reading unless you're an otolaryngologist. But even in cases of illness, hard texts are just too hard. And yet, this wasn't a case where I couldn't pronounce all the words. It was just a case where I didn't know the meanings of lots of words or have the background knowledge necessary to make sense out of them. High success in reading is essential to developing reading fluency, both oral and silent. And it's one of the reasons that rereading a text multiple times was listed by the National Reading Panel as one of the successful techniques for fostering fluency. If after reading the text you not only have read the words multiple times, and you start to get a sense for how the text goes and so on, so you can use semantic and syntactic cues as well as the graphophonemic cues in the word. But perhaps more interestingly and excitingly for me, Melanie Kuhn and her colleagues have demonstrated that you can have, if you take one large group of kids in 2 states and have them do 30 minutes of repeated readings a day, and another group of kids, you have them do 30 minutes of self-selected high accuracy reading a day, that the gains in fluency are identical between the two groups. The difference is that the extensive reading kids learn to read fluently faster than the kids doing the repeated readings. And in addition, they acquire more new vocabulary, more world knowledge, and better comprehension skills than the kids doing the repeated readings. So, I tell people all the time, you have to understand, most repeated reading studies lasted 3 weeks or less. And if you've been doing something with some kids that are struggling with oral reading fluency, and you've been doing it for 3 weeks and they aren't cured, you're doing something wrong. So stop doing whatever you've been doing and try a technique that might actually work, which would involve access to lots of books they can actually read and the opportunity to actually read those books. Read something they understand. Barking at a text and getting all the words right, but not understanding what you read is not reading. Reading involves understanding what you've read. The other is called word calling or barking at print. And the number of minutes kids spend engaged in word calling activities, reading accurately but with no comprehension, doesn't improve reading achievement and doesn't produce any reading growth. Understanding what you've read is different from remembering what you've read. And that's another central thing, if for no other reason than most core reading programs have dropped all of the questions, the good questions, the ones that used to say answers will vary. They've dropped them from the teacher's editions to ask kids because too many people in too many uptight states were saying they couldn't judge fidelity of implementation if they didn't know what answer the kid was supposed to give. My solution was read the damn text. Then you might know what answer the kid should give. But nonetheless, we now have more and more text-dependent, trivial questions about trivial details in the text than ever before. And if we wanted to waste kids' time, that's a pretty good way to do it. Because if you're paying attention to what color the dog's left ear was, then you probably aren't reading for big idea understanding, but rather trivial idea recall. Recall of text information is easier than understanding text information. And if we bias kids by asking them lots of detailed questions, we can get kids that only read to recall of detail, and they no longer start to puzzle about what this text actually means or what the author meant or what it might mean to them. So my question is simply, if I were to have enough money to go and just randomly sample one reading lesson from every teacher in this room or one reading lesson from every teacher in Wyoming without you knowing I was there, would I see reading lessons that are focused on understanding the text or lessons that are focused on simply remembering what the text said? Kids need to write, and in fact, what we do know about phonemic segmentation, for instance, and letter name knowledge and letter sound knowledge is that the most powerful activities anyone's ever produced is invented writing. There's no faster way to get kids interested in learning letter names, letter sounds, letter shapes, or interested in learning about say it slow, stretch it out, write down all the sounds you hear, than to give them the opportunity to engage in writing about something they're interested in. Hardly any of us could write very well. If I gave you a task right now and said, take the next 10 minutes and write everything that you know we've learned just in the last decade about Inca civilization. Now, some of you aren't nearly as interested in Inca civilization as I am, and some of you have never been to Machu Picchu or to Cusco or some of the other historic sites that are still there, still serving as homes and ceremonial centers that were built during the Inca Empire. Some of you aren't as interested, and if you aren't as interested, you probably don't know as much as I do. But I'm really interested in this, and so I want all of you to write about it. And what I'll be able to demonstrate is some of you have a writing disability. Now, this will not mean that you actually have a writing disability. It'll mean that you don't know much or care much about the Incas. But if I gave you 10 minutes to write on something you care about, you could demonstrate that you actually can write well. But unfortunately, much of the writing that's done in and for school is writing on topics that someone else has identified, and often they're the most idiotic things, like 5-paragraph essays, which somebody came up with as a good way to respond. I've never read a 5-paragraph essay in print, except in the materials that they prepare as test prep materials for writing tests. But reading and writing are substantially interrelated in ways that we could spend a whole semester just exploring. But we've, for the last decade, writing was left out of the reading program largely because the reading first folks said writing is something different. You do that at a different time during the day, not during reading time. Another idiotic, unresearched guideline. Worksheets aren't writing. Sentences, filling in a missing word or even filling in a full sentence is not composing or writing. Writing to a prompt isn't the sort of writing that people do in the real world. Everybody in this room that has written something in the last week, the number of you that wrote it to an identified topic or a prompt is roughly equal to the number of you enrolled in a graduate course. Instead, when we write about the real world, in the real world, we write about things we care about and things we know about. And I have no idea why so little writing is done in school, but there's even less now than there was a decade ago, and none of that looks like it's in the best interest of children. Talking to peers about reading and writing, it may surprise you, but we've learned a lot in the last decade about what I call literate conversation. And that's simply the ability to engage in discussion of a book you've just read. And everybody in this room knows how to engage in literate conversation. So if you finished a book and you see one of the other teachers has that book on the table or in their purse, and they're halfway through it, you say, how do you like it? And then you'll actually engage in a conversation about it. And you don't interrogate each other. The person who's read the book doesn't say, and what was Isabella's middle name? What was her maiden name? What was her youngest sister's name? And so on. I mean, we never get to the level of the trivial detail. But we, in fact, engage each other in, do you believe it? Can you believe it? Do you know anyone like that? Doesn't that remind you a lot of Bob, our principal? or my ex-husband, or whatever. But literate conversations are fundamental to most middle-class home environments, but they tend to be missing in most lower-income home environments, in part because many of those people have a lower income because they never learned to read and write very well, and they went to schools where their days were filled up with more and more phonics worksheets and more vocabulary worksheets and assignments where they looked things up but they looked up the meaning of a single word, not the history of the Inca people. We've got good research that demonstrates that even adding a little bit of literate conversation in middle schools and high schools, adding as little as 10 minutes of conversation per period, dramatically affects not just the learning of that content, but also the standardized test scores in ways that 10 minutes of strategy instruction or 10 minutes of test preparation or 10 minutes of underlining don't help. We get better outcomes when kids actually get to talk to each other than when we make them sit there quietly and doing their work. Marty Nystrom reviewed a lot of this research back in 2006 in research in the teaching of English. And he and Arthur Appleby and Judith Langer collaborated on a study that showed if you simply added a little bit of conversation to middle school science and social studies classrooms, you dramatically improved science and social studies achievement, and standardized reading comprehension test score achievement. The problem they had is that even in the study, they couldn't, it was hard to get teachers of low-income middle school kids to allow them to engage in conversation. Far too many classrooms, kids never get an opportunity to turn to another and talk about what they've read. But in the classic study that Fall and Chowsky did in Connecticut on a 2-day test, kids on one day, one group of kids on one day took the test, and when the test period is up, they were told to turn to their neighbor. It might be a person they knew, might not, and spend the next 10 minutes talking about what you both just read. In the other set of classrooms, the kids were given 10 minutes and a colored highlighter and told to go back through the text and highlight all the important information. The next day, the two groups switched, and the group that did the highlighting on the second day did the pure conversation, and the group that did the pure conversation the first day did the highlighting. The effect of pure conversation improved the achievement test scores by about 40% over the kids on the state reading achievement test over the kids who engaged in the highlighting activities. We don't need any more studies demonstrating that conversation is powerful, and literate conversation is sort of the essence of what we want kids to be able to do when they leave school. Finally, listen to a fluent adult reader read aloud. We don't need any more studies that demonstrate that reading aloud to kids is a powerful way to foster vocabulary growth and to foster world knowledge. And whether it's a high school American history teacher or a middle school science teacher or a first grade teacher, reading aloud to kids for every day for perhaps 10 minutes is a powerful way to foster all kinds of growth, as well as perhaps to introduce books or bless books to children who don't know much about books. Teachers ask me, where are we going to find the time? Well, I'm hoping that Barack Obama calls me soon to replace Arnie Duncan. And I want you to know, as soon as I'm the U.S. As soon as I'm named Secretary of Education, I'm going to ban the use of workbooks, worksheets, test preps. I'm going to ban copy machines from elementary, middle schools, and high schools. And we're going to use all that money we save, and we're also going to eliminate most of the testing, because if we test kids about 3 times during their K-12 career, it gives us as much information as testing them every week. And it leaves a lot more time for actually teaching kids and for kids to actually learn things. But if we replace worksheet time with literate conversation, with read alouds, with self-selected reading, with self-selected writing, we'll have better outcomes than if we have kids continue to engage in low-level fill-in-the-blank activities. It isn't time that's the problem, folks. It's the design of the Common Reading Program materials that emphasize aspects of that program that will make the greatest amount of profit. And they don't make much profit when they sell you the anthology. They're willing to sell you the anthology at a discount and a nonprofit making price in some cases, because they know for the next 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, you're going to be buying the workbooks, the tests, and everything else that are thrown together by a handful of outside off-the-street folks and marketed as scientific reading material. It's teachers' beliefs that have to change. It's teachers who think that having kids talk to each other is a waste of time. And also it's noisy, and my principal doesn't like noisy classrooms. You can teach kids to engage in each other in what we call whisper talk, and the principal won't even know they're talking if that's something you have to worry about. But if that's something you have to worry about, you should be figuring out a plan for replacing the principal very soon. We can make these kinds of changes, and unfortunately kids can't. So we could teach every child to read. We can also create a population of kids kids who actually read. But to achieve these goals, we're going to have to change what we do and how kids spend their time and how we spend our money. And the question is just going to be, are we smart enough to do it? Or are we going to continue down the line that's been accelerated in the last 10 years of wasting more and more precious instructional time on things that matter less and less about learning to read? I'll leave it to you. Good luck, Wyoming.